Okay, so welcome everyone, and a quick note that we are recording and that this recording will be published on our YouTube channel, History at Newcastle. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land, wherever you may be located, and to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and in particular to the Bidjigal and Gadigal peoples of the Aurora Nation, on whose land I'm located today. Our presenter today, who is co-hosted by the Center for the Study of Violence, is Uğur Ümit Üngör, Professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at the University of Amsterdam and the NIOD Institute for War, Holocaust and Genocide Studies. His main area of interest is the history and sociology of mass violence, with a particular focus on the modern and contemporary Middle East. His publications include The Making of Modern Turkey, Nation and State in Eastern Anatolia, 1913 to 1950, which is published by Oxford University Press in 2011. Paramilitarism, Mass Violence in the Shadow of the State, also published by Oxford University Press in 2020. And the forthcoming Assad's Militias and Mass Violence in Syria, published by Cambridge, or to be published by Cambridge University Press in 2025. His paper today stems, I think, from this latter research and is titled Syrian Gulag, an Unending History of Assad's Prison System. Uğur, over to you.
Thank you very much, Sasha. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are. It's a pleasure to be speaking about this very difficult topic, but that is, of course, at the same time very topical, considering what's going on in the region and beyond. I'm going to share my presentation, if that's okay.
Great.
So, I hope this is visible.
Yep.
All right. So the project that ended in a book called Syrian Gulag is a cooperation between me and a Syrian researcher and former detainee named Jaber Beckert. And maybe I'll say a few things about how the project came into being. As you all know, the Syrian uprising that started in 2011 quickly escalated into a multi-sided civil war and proxy war. Within time span of a decade, killed over 500,000 people, displaced half the country. Half of those displaced are internally displaced, the other half externally displaced, which is about 6 million people officially. And a large number of those, about 1 million, fled to Europe in very difficult circumstances and conditions. And it's this wave of Syrian refugees that actually poured out all these stories about imprisonment. And when I was in that period, this is about 2014, 15, and 16 especially, I was interviewing Syrians about their experiences living in the Assad regime. I mean, how did it feel? How was it to grow up in a deeply authoritarian regime for generations? So that is a type of research on authoritarian practices, also on state violence, and on survival. So how do civilians navigate having to deal with threats, but almost the permanent threat of violence? And as I was doing these interviews, without me even asking it, people would start talking about imprisonment and prison and detention and torture. And so I thought this is probably a very prominent element of this. So at some point I was attending a talk by Jaber. He wrote a book once on a hospital called 601, which is a hospital close to, it's in Damascus, close to the military airport. And the hospital is used or was abused as a center of extermination. And as he was telling the story after the lecture, I walked up to him and I said, why is it that there is no overview book of the Syrian prisons in general? So there are memoirs, really, really powerful memoirs. And there are some good essays. But there's no overview, for example, how many prisons are there, what is the scale of it, who is staffing it. And so he said such a book doesn't exist. So I just proposed to him, why don't we write that book together? And he agreed, and so we did. And it was published last year with Ivy Torres. It's called Syrian Gulag Inside Assad's Prison System. And it's, to be explicit here, it's a book geared for a general audience. So it's not an academic book, but it's for a general audience. And that was on purpose because The book is going to be also, it's going to come out in a number of languages, including in French, German, and especially in Arabic. And in Arabic, it's exceptionally important because Syrians themselves need to have access to the knowledge as well. So it's a kind of unfair knowledge practice to extract all the information, write an academic book that only a few of us can understand in the global north, and then not let that trickle back. That's not that's not a good form of civic science. So we decided to make for general audience. This is the structure of the book. The argument of the book is that the Syrian Gulag, and we chose the name Gulag on purpose, and I can get into that as well, is a four-dimensional system of arrest, detention, imprisonment, and torture that is geared towards repressing and demobilizing Syrians politically, and in disciplining the society into conforming to the Assad regime. That's basically, in a nutshell, the argument of the book, and these four dimensions are the intelligence branches, so basically the secret service, that have their own prisons, the military prisons, also known as central prisons, the civil prisons, and the secret prisons. And together, these four dimensions, they gear into each other and they produce really unprecedented levels of violence in Syrian history, and possibly even in like Near Eastern history. And the only maybe parallel that even comes close to it is possibly Saddam Hussein's similar Ba'athist regime and similar prison system of detention and torture. The cover painting is by a Syrian-American artist called Fadia Afashi. It's called The Empty Chair. She once invited me to her home in Los Angeles, and this was a life-size painting in her house. And as soon as I walked in, I said, "This is the cover for our book. Can we use it?" And she graciously allowed us to do so. So we want to thank her for that as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk through these four dimensions, and then I'm going to give a few snippets of examples of how it is to live in this system, what the type of violent practices are, and then towards the end, we can look towards the kind of aftermath of prison. Because once you're basically never out of prison. You're always, even when you're released, mentally, a lot of these people, they still are detained. The questions we ask, and I apologize, by the way, trigger warning for there's going to be, apart from these drawings, there's going to be one gruesome photo, and I will give a heads up when that's happening. But of course, you can't get around it. Sanitizing the violence doesn't work. And the three questions we ask ourselves in the book are these following questions: how did or does the Assad regime build its power through its prison system? How do the perpetrators function in the system? And how does the specter of the prison system affect Syrian society more broadly? And so those people who are not imprisoned, like family members or friends or neighbors or children of detainees, for example, how do they fare? How have they been affected by the fact that their parents or their siblings, their children were imprisoned? And the first two questions, I think we answered them. The last question, we realized that it requires actually a much broader historical and sociological examination, because we feel we only scratched the surface actually of the depth of the suffering. A couple of images here to evoke the types of torture that we're speaking about. Now, any and all discussion on the Assad regime has to start with its coercive apparatus. The state has the monopoly of violence. How does that monopoly look? What is the architecture of that monopoly? And there are basically four major elements here. One is the army and the police, which is fairly common. I mean, most states have an army and a police. I think Costa Rica doesn't have an army. That's one of the few states in the world that does not have an army. But of course, you need to have monopoly of violence. Then there is, in green bullet points, the intelligence agencies. And there's not one, not two, but four omnipotent, exceptionally ruthless agencies that are collectively called in Arabic mukhabarat. So mukhabarat in Turkish you would say istikhbarat. Mukhabarat is the generic overarching like umbrella term for intelligence in the Arabic world. And there are four in Syria. The military, and this is in order of prominence: military intelligence, Air Force intelligence, the political security, and the state security. And I'll get into how they work together and against each other and what their division of labor is. Then in blue bullet points, we have the Praetorian Guards. So these are the kind of highly trained, equipped, exceptionally loyal shock troops of the regime. The 4th Armored Brigade, the Republican Guard, and the Special Forces. The 4th Armored Brigade, by the way, for a long time was run by the brother of the current president, who's named Maher al-Assad. You see a picture of him here. And then finally, in 2011, the regime established a paramilitary group, loosely organized, but increasingly more centrally organized, called Shabbiha. And these were mostly civilians that were armed to repress the uprising. So when you go on YouTube and you type in Syria demonstration 2011, towards the end of that demonstration, invariably you have people coming and shooting, beating up people, arresting them. Most often, these are the Shabbiha that had to carry out these tasks. So in the paramilitarism book, I touch on it a little bit, but hopefully the forthcoming book will look at that a little bit more in detail, because I have done a number of interviews with the Shabbiha directly with themselves, and by asking them how they experienced the conflict. So let's get started with the main intelligence, the most powerful intelligence agency, which is the military intelligence. And the military intelligence obviously, as the name says, the jurisdiction over the army and the armed forces. Because if you want to coup-proof a regime, you don't want the army to organize a coup d'etat. So that's why the military intelligence is at least as powerful as the army in Syria. It has a supreme authority on spying on any and all ordinary military personnel, commissioned and non-commissioned officers, all the way up to general and admirals and whatnot. And they have, and this, of course, is a product of post-war Syrian history. So in post-colonial Syrian history of 1946 onward, within the first 15 years, there were 8 different coup d'etats. And so to coup-proof it, Hafez Assad in 1970 established these intelligence agencies, empowered them so they could keep control on the army. Now, when you see here on the map, you see B and then a number. So B stands for branch in Arabic, Fra, and the numbers are to some extent kind of almost randomly assigned. But these branches, they have certain specializations. So obviously some of them are the provincial centers. And then in Damascus, you have a number of branches that are specialized in particular things, such as there's a branch that works on digital surveillance, that basically taps all the phones, that listens in on the conversations, for example, or that checks people's emails and digital communication. There's a branch which is called the branch that which means the branch that's responsible for storming and arresting people inside Damascus. So there's specializations. Also in some cases, the military intelligence is responsible for border control. So when you go, let's say you travel from Beirut to Damascus, which is only a 2-hour drive, when you're on the Syrian border, very often there are like 2 or 3 checkpoints. The first of the checkpoints, most often was, at least before the conflict, was the military intelligence. They check anything and everything that comes into the country. And so what is a branch? So imagine a city like, take Aleppo or take Hasakeh or Homs. A big, gray, ugly building in the middle of the city, a couple of floors above ground, a couple of floors underground. Above ground, we have the administrative staff, and underground, we have the cells and the torture chambers, where the investigation happens, allegedly. And very often the street and the entire area is cordoned off. There's no way of entering a street where a branch is. And there even some people have been arrested even for just looking at the branch, just looking at the building for too long. That's already considered suspicious to the regime. Then we have the Air Force intelligence. I might think, why does the Air Force have its own intelligence agency? That's for 2 reasons. One is, of course, air power is a supreme form of military strength. Now, if you control the fighter jets, you can obviously do quite a lot of damage to cities and to people on the ground. And second, more importantly, because Hafiz Assad, he was a pilot himself, and a decorated one as well. He fought in a number of theaters, and then as he climbed inside the Air Force, he built his own intelligence regime, where he appointed his loyalists. And by the time in 1970, when he staged his coup d'état, that patronage network became a separate intelligence agency. And here too, we have in Damascus, for example, I mean, there are different regions. In Damascus, we have the investigation branch, the administration, the aviation command, which checks on pilots, because in the beginning of the uprising, a number of pilots refused to bomb their own city. So they wanted to defect, take their airplanes, their MiGs and Sukhoi, and flee to Jordan, for example. To make sure that that didn't happen, the Air Force intelligence keeps really close track of them. And there's also the headquarters here in the green dot under Damascus. That's the military airport called Mezza in Damascus, and that's really kind of the epicenter of the regime, where a lot of the decisions are taken. Now, those two are the military intelligence agencies. They're formally related to the Ministry of Defense. Then you have two civil intelligence agencies. They're slightly less powerful, but only slightly. And those are the political security and the state security. And political security, obviously, as the name says, keeps tabs on any political activity inside the country. Right? So let's say that you're a group like 3 or 4 Syrian students at the University of Damascus, and you want to set up like an environmental protection NGO. So this is considered an illegal congregation. And the political security will make sure that they visit you on the very first time that you'll convene. And they will ask you what is, they'll probably bring you into the branch and ask you what it is that you intend to achieve with this environmental protection NGO. And that's only at that level. You know, forget if you want to establish a political party, or if you want to, for example, come together and argue for Kurdish rights, or argue for rights of underrepresented minorities, or these type of things. The political security is also responsible for the, let's say, student activity. So as we know, students, they can be recalcitrant, as we've seen in the past year. And so the political security makes sure that there's no activity on campus that can be seen as critical of the regime. And so that's always what they look for. There is, to give an example, you see here in the left top corner of the province of Idlib. So Idlib is a province that the Assad regime lost in military, in the skirmishes. The Free Syrian Army took over, and then later Islamists, they took over the province. The branch, the political security branch, that was based in Idlib, relocated to Damascus, and it actually continues to work on Idlib province from Damascus since 2012. So for 12 years, actually, the branch has been in exile. Imagine that for a second. And then we have the state security, the fourth intelligence agency, and this is the oldest intelligence agency, and also in the old days, under the French mandate, as well as in the immediate post-war, post-colonial period, it was the only and main intelligence agency, which was quickly, of course, superseded by the others. And these guys, they're responsible for a number of old dossiers, for example, spying on minorities. So Syria is a minoritarian regime. There are, of course, there are Alawites, Christians, Druze, Ismailis, a number of other Christian denominations. And the loyalty of those communities is key for the survival of the Assad regime. And the regime knew this from way back from the 70s. So the state security keeps tabs on these. Like I once, for example, interviewed an Armenian priest from Aleppo, and he said that every week on Sunday before the sermon, before the service in the church, the state security agents, they would walk in and ask him exactly what he was going to say in the sermon in Armenian, and they would make sure that they would admonish him also. That's a beautiful sermon, Father, but make sure that you always praise His Excellency President Bashar al-Assad in your speeches, and that we should always be thankful of him that he keeps the country together. So these type of activities are part of the state security as well. So as you can see, actually, most of these intelligence agencies, they work internally. So externally, only really the Air Force intelligence and to some extent military intelligence are authorized to work outside the country. For example, spying on embassies or consulates or on the diaspora. By the way, here you see in Damascus, there's branch 251, which is called the Khatib branch. It's an investigative branch for Damascus and a prominent one of state security. The head of that branch fled to Germany in 2016. He was arrested there, put on trial, and he received a life sentence. I will return to him in a later slide. So this gives a bit of a sense of these intelligence agencies, right? And we can get into like, why are there 4 intelligence agencies? Why is this a kind of overstaffed and bloated bureaucracy? I mean, there are surely reasons for that. But suffice it to say that the intelligence agencies, they function as a type of vacuum cleaner in society. Right? So anybody and everybody that's a threat or perceived as a threat is vacuumed into these branches, processed there, and then sent off either to the military prisons, which I'll talk about now, or to the civil prisons. Right? So there's a fork. You can go either one to the other. Military prisons if they think you're a serious threat, to the civil prisons if they think you've learned your lesson. So that's kind of how the Gulag works, the 4-dimensional system works. But first I want to take you on a little intermezzo. The best way to understand the Syrian prison system is through human stories. We've done a lot of interviews with survivors, eyewitnesses, and even in the case of few perpetrators, but few, and mostly defectors actually. But here's the story of a man that a man who I interviewed in 2016, who was originally from Damascus, born in Aleppo, but grew up in Damascus. And it's a typical story that can happen to you. A young man is arrested in 2011 for posting on Facebook against the regime. Plainclothes Mukhabarat officers show up on his doorstep at midnight. Come with us to the branch just for a quick coffee, 5 minutes. That's a dead giveaway, by the way. He suffers 3 months of torture. Hanging from a ceiling, he's whipped until he soils himself. He develops scurvy and a hernia in his spinal disc. After release, he goes back home and can't sleep at night anymore. A few months later, someone knocks on the door again. 2 grim men. Come with us to the branch. But sir, you already arrested me. I just came out of prison. Not yet by us. That was political security. We are the Air Force intelligence. And again, he suffers months of torture until he's released, and then he flees to Europe. And so it shows a little bit how also these agencies are not necessarily aware of each other's work, or the levels of coordination are low and the levels of competition are high. Now, that brings me to the military prisons. And these are a type of concentration camps, really, where the regime throws people on a massive scale for them to basically languish or to be tortured to death or ultimately perish in any other way. And it all started with Mezza. Mezza is a hill right outside of Damascus. That's where the first prison was built by the French colonial authorities, and which was taken over by the post-war governments and ultimately by the Assad regime. That's where most of the elite prisoners were sent. So, for example, those who supported Abdel Nasser, those who supported the Ba'ath Party in Iraq, the communists and Islamist leaders, for example, almost all of them ended up in Mezza to demobilize them. And even also some of the former allies of President Assad, like Salah Jadid, for example, one of his close friends who he then sidetracked, were imprisoned in Mezza until they died. Now, at some point, the capacity can't take it, and the regime then built and expanded an existing small prison in the city of Palmyra. Palmyra is known for the famous antiquities, and ISIS blew up the temples, etc. But actually, the heart of darkness there is the prison camp that was in place there. And the Arabic name for Palmyra is Tadmur. The prison also was called Tadmur. And this was a vast camp where the regime, from the late 70s onwards, the 80s especially onward, imprisoned large numbers of political activists and those people who were suspected of having anti-regime sentiments. And in this period, this is where a large number of memoirs came out. So a lot of those men are now, mostly men, they are now in their 60s. and in the past decade and a half, they've published on those experiences in the late 80s, early 90s. Now, at some point, that camp too, it's either obsolete or it becomes kind of dilapidated. And the regime then builds, this is under in the 1990s, starts building a prison to the north of Damascus called Sednaya. And this is a really vast camp. This is like it has 3 major wings where they can imprison on paper at least thousands of people. They finished it in the 90s, late 90s, and then under Bashar al-Assad, most of the prisoners that were sent to Sednaya after being arrested by the Mukhabarat. And Sednaya too, there was an uprising in 2009 there, which was bloodily repressed. And since 2011, it's been a camp really for detention and for also mass executions. So at some point from 2013 onwards, the regime executed hundreds of people every week. There was a weekly execution time where they sent summary execution to the gallows. Hundreds of detainees that they felt had to make place for. I'm not exactly sure what the thinking is behind it, but there were most of those were demonstrators that were arrested in demonstrations. Now, then we have the third dimension of the Gulag, which are the civil prisons. These are, let's say, the normal prisons for judicial prisoners, right? So if you steal or you murder someone or you run over somebody in traffic, then you are sent to one of these civil prisons. And then in the civil prisons, the conditions are very different. They're actually almost bearable, right? And maybe they're not like prisons here in the Netherlands where you get computer games and hot showers and warm meals, etc., and you get free time. And it's maybe not like that, of course, but relative to Syria, this is a fairly bearable set of conditions. And many detainees that were released from either the Mukhabarat prisons there or from the intelligence or from the central prisons there, they experience being in a civil prison as a kind of release. You know, there are bed sheets, there's no torture, there's shops where you can buy some food. The prison administration allows you to, for example, to make music or read literature or to even talk to each other. And the levels of torture and violence is much lower. And this is generally a kind of purgatory before they release you. And the regime, in a way, does that on purpose because it wanted people to regain the strength a bit before they release them into society, right? Because otherwise you have these emaciated people walking around. And then finally, since 2011, we have the phenomenon of the secret prisons because the uprising was such a challenge to the regime, and they established these Shabiha paramilitaries. Those Shabiha and the special forces, and those last 2 categories in the monopoly of violence, they started establishing their own prisons. And this could be, for example, an old farm in the middle of the countryside, like Der Schmeel, for example, between Homs and Hama. An old farm, like a ranch, basically an American parlor, in the middle of the countryside, where, of course, a farm has gates and it has barns, and they would use those barns and those gates as a type of surrogate prison. And the conditions in these secret prisons really were the worst, according to survivors of numerous these dimensions, because there was no prison regime. You had these militiamen. They would get drunk at night, drinking arak, and then they would just take out people from the barn and just execute them in front of the street. You were basically an object of the whims and of the impulses, really, of these militiamen. That's also why we have almost no information about these secret prisons. There are only a few survivors, key survivors of these prisons. Now, this system, so the Mukhabarat, the central prisons, the civil prisons, and the secret prisons, they gear into each other. And the way that it works is, as I said, the Mukhabarat is a type of vacuum cleaner. Then they decide, it was almighty, they decide whether somebody goes to a civil prison and can be released later, or they have to be punished and go to a central prison. And then in the secret prisons, you can end up there at any time if you're arrested, happen to be arrested by these militias. So that's kind of how the system works. Now, I can imagine people are looking at this photo of Bashar al-Assad, and I'm using the same photo. And you know, in these, like the PR of the Assad regime, you always see Assad in a crisp Italian suit, which are always bulletproof, by the way. But the men behind him who are actually responsible for the violence, they're almost never in the picture. And a lot of people wouldn't even know who they are or their importance, actually. We argue that the relevance of these intelligence bosses can't be overstated. They are really incredibly powerful in this country. Not only do they advise the president, but also they take executive decisions for the violence. And the gentleman in the back here with his briefcase and his blue suit is Ali Mamlouk. Ali Mamlouk is he's a boomer, to put it that way, born in 1946. Was in the post-war period, was close to Hafiz Assad. So when Hafiz Assad staged the coup d'etat, Ali Mamlouk was also catapulted to power. He was responsible for suppressing the uprising in Hama, 1982, because he became involved in the Air Force intelligence. And he grew up in the ranks of the Air Force intelligence. So he once started as a relatively low officer, where you had to torture people to prove yourself to prove your loyalty to the organization. That's how he kind of grew up. And we know this because we interviewed a bunch of old guys who are now in their 60s and 70s who were tortured personally by Ali Mamlouk. Of course, as he climbs the ranks of the bureaucracy, he becomes more powerful. He's no longer on the work floor, put it that way. He's responsible for the chemical weapons program, by the way. That was almost entirely in his hands. And in 2005, he was promoted to the General Intelligence Director, which is basically you're in charge of all four of these agencies. He was also responsible for channeling jihadists to Iraq. So people fighting American forces there, where almost all of them came in through Damascus and were put on buses in Damascus and sent across the border to Iraq. And when the uprising began, he was the supreme person responsible for repressing it. So there are a number of leaked documents, for example, leaked orders from the regime, and almost all of them, they bear his signature. Ultimately, it goes back to his authority. Now, let me give a second snapshot, like a human snapshot of what it means to be ensnared in this prison regime. And this is a story that is pretty famous. That's told across space and across generations of a man who woke up once from a dream in which he saw that no longer Hafiz Assad was the president of Syria, but himself. In this dream, his friends circle were the cabinet of the government. He tells the dream to his wife, who tells it to a friend, who tells it to a friend, whose husband is in the mukhabarat. The regime arrested the entire cabinet. Now, why is this happening? I mean, in essence, the prison regime is geared because it's politicized, and it's mostly 90% of all prisoners are political prisoners. It is a form of depoliticizing, demobilizing, and disciplining Syrian society. The regime doesn't want people to commit to actual and effective opposition politics. And the way to think about it is that there are basically two, let's say, boxes of politics. There's kind of permissible politics here in the green box on the left, which of course the Ba'ath party is at the top. Preferably everybody is a member of it. But if not, there are a number of sham parties. So the Ahzab and Ahzab Shakliya, as they say in Arabic, which are those parties that were kind of astroturfed, established by the regime or tolerated by the regime, who don't really challenge the regime, or even in the, like a coalition with the regime, who sit in parliament and then they talk about, for example, well, in this neighborhood in Damascus, the height of the sidewalks is a little too high, and the kids don't like playing there, so could they be a little lower, right? While there are thousands of people suffering. So a number of these, including the officially sanctioned Communist Party, for example, or the Socialist Union, these are sham parties. They don't really challenge. The regime has no problem with them. I mean, preferably not, but because preferably Ba'ath party, but if you really have to, okay, these parties are permissible. And then there's a huge box of impermissible politics, which of course starts with the Muslim Brotherhood, what it says in the Syrian constitution now that the Muslim Brotherhood is a terrorist organization and membership punishable by death. Then we have a number of other like Islamist parties, the Hizb ut-Tahrir al-Islami from the 2000s. which was kind of like, it was something maybe like the Muslim Brotherhood, a little bit more center-right maybe. There was a Communist Labour Party, the Kurdistan Democratic Party, and a number of other small liberal parties, including small Kurdish parties, and of course, ultimately, everybody who demonstrated in 2011. That was an impermissible form of politics. If you had a problem with the regime, with anything, you should have gone through the sham parties. But of course, the issues that you could bring forth to the sham parties are inconsequential. So everybody that demonstrated in 2011, impermissible politics, arrest, and to the Syrian Gulag. Now, one of the best memoirs, if you ever want to read a memoir that will haunt you for weeks, is this one by Mustafa Khalifa called The Shell. Mustafa Khalifa is a man still alive who lives in France, who was one of those early detainees in Tadmur, in Palmyra prison. And I mean, I've been doing genocide research for 20 years, but even I was shaken by the depth of this memoir. Not only like the levels of violence and the atrocities, I mean, that's one thing, but the way that he explains the impact it made on him personally as a human being, decades after he was released, that really got to me, actually. For example, there's one, I mean, it's written as a novel as if it was someone else, but we know that he's talking about himself. For example, he recites an instance in which the protagonist of the memoir is being tortured, and at some point he's crying out, and then one of the torturers spits in his mouth, right? And so to humiliate him, to basically create a form of create an abject moment for him. And he says that in the years after, you know, I've tried everything, he said. I've tried rinsing my mouth with mint water. I've tried drinking alcohol. I've tried anything and everything. But that taste never leaves my mouth, he says. And it's an incredible way of actually of verbalizing actually your pain and your survival, which I thought was, and the book is replete with these stories. And then, of course, the regime established Sayd Naya. There are no photos of it because nobody can come close to the place and take photos. And if you work inside of it, you can't use any cameras. So we have satellite images only. Here's the main prison on the left. It has that, what they call the Mercedes sign, you know, so that kind of triangle shape. And then on the right, we have what the regime established in 2017, a probable crematorium, because this building on the right didn't exist before. And we know that because at some point in the courtyard, we see in the satellite images, we see hundreds of bodies. Then when the satellite turns around the Earth again, the bodies are gone, but then there's a smoke coming out of the chimney. No, that would be exceptionally coincidental if that wasn't related. So, but closer than that, empirically, we can't get to this prison. But the stories there are pretty harrowing. There are people my age, for example, 43, who spent their entire adulthood in this prison, for example. Now, I apologize for this picture, but I mentioned the military airport Mezze near Damascus. And at some point, there was a military photographer who had to take pictures of dead people because he had to document it. He had to document the cause of death. And all of those people who were tortured to death, as they came through that system, he also had to take their pictures because that was procedure. He took 33,000 photos, and at some point, he took them on a USB stick, and he ran off to Europe. He's under protected identity. His name is Caesar. I mean, I've been pretty deep in the Syrian community. I've been absolutely unable to reach him, for example. I also don't want to, in a way. And the images that he takes, they're all online, by the way, so that the victims' families can identify their loved ones, because otherwise, no way of finding out who these people are. Almost all of them are close-ups of pretty gruesome, and you can see the forensic evidence on the torture of the bodies. But there's one photo, which is this one, in which you see the perpetrators. This is the only photo where you see the perpetrators at work, actually. And the matter-of-factly way, the kind of industrial way that they kind of, oh, these people they all died under torture, so they were tortured to death. We have to bag them up, put them in a corner, and then the truck will bring them to the mass grave and dump them in it. And this is, I think, the kind of, the matter of the bureaucratic, almost industrial way of working, I think, is something that's a watershed, I think, in the history of the region. Now, I mentioned already the State Security Branch 251 in Damascus. Remember the head of the branch fled to Germany and he was arrested. He went on trial in the city of Koblenz. This is his name, Anwar Raslan, convicted to life. And I went to some of the hearings, and it was pretty interesting because he basically sat there. I looked at him almost the whole time. And of course, well, victims were coming in, they were torturing, they were breaking down, talking about how they were tortured, how they were deceived by him, and whatnot and whatnot. So in total, I think the German court in Koblenz, the Oberlandesgericht, I think there were about 40 survivors from that prison were heard. And in the end, Raslan was convicted for the death of, I think, 300, 400 people and the torture of thousands. And in the entire trial, throughout the entire trial, he didn't say a single word. He just took notes, copious notes. And only when the trial was done, he said, I'm going to publish my own version of this history. This is a sham trial. So we actually have an application running to try to visit him in prison and to try to get his side of the story. Now, a third intermezzo. This is the last kind of human snapshot. In the year 2016, a former detainee was invited to give a guest lecture at a Dutch university about his experiences of arrest and detention in Syria. And spoiler alert, this was me inviting some. He explained that in 2011, 3 plainclothes intelligence operatives arrested him near his university campus, pushed him in the trunk of a car, drove him to an underground dungeon, and tortured him for 2 months. He was never charged with an official accusation, never allowed to consult a lawyer, and never found out the identities of the men who had arrested and tortured him. Consequently, he suffered great physical and psychological scars from his arrest. A full classroom of almost 100 students listened breathlessly for about an hour. When he finished and it was time for question and answer, a young woman raised her hand and asked, "But why didn't you go to the police?" Right? Which I think is, in its naivete, in its Dutch naivete, it's actually a good question. Right? Because what does the Syrian police do? And I was standing there, it happened in my class, and I looked at my friend, the former detainee, and he looked at me, and he was going to burst into laughter, but I thought this is not the moment to cut the tension, because then I followed up and said, what would have happened actually if you had gone to the police? And he said that if I went to the police station and I tried to file a complaint, the entire police station would have been arrested, and they would be in the same prison jail, in the same jail cell that I was at. Because that's the disempowerment of the Syrian police. Now, the way that we do this research was, on the one hand, we try to combine top-down perpetrator data with bottom-up victim data. This is relatively difficult to do. Because needless to say, we don't have access to any archives. Nobody walks into Damascus and starts asking questions about prisons. So how do you research something that was set up not to be researched, right? And yet had incredible impact on the society? I mean, that's the paradox. Incredible impact on the society, defines Syrian identity, and yet it's unresearchable. So we had to do a bit of patchwork, a bit of social media, contacting people, interviewing them, and trying to triangulate it. And here's an image of the young man on the right with the glasses. And I'm showing the picture with his permission here. Ekrem Saud, who in 1988 he was arrested 3 times, and they barely made it out. And we explain his story, and we expound on his story in the book. But so no need to get into detail. But the important thing here is that one major takeaway of it is the expense that the regime takes, the energy that the regime affords in arresting people, handling them, transferring them. For example, he was at some point arrested in Aleppo by one branch, and then there was information that he was arrested in Damascus. So they took on a military airplane and flew him all the way to Damascus just to process him. And this is in the middle of the ongoing war, right? So this is what the regime spends resources on. That in itself is already fascinating. And then he made it out. He's in the Netherlands now. And we are in the process of producing a graphic novel about his experiences. That would be interesting. Now, there's also problems when Syrians arrive in Europe. How do you explain yourself that all of these terrible things happen to you? And so the perceptions and representations by state organs and officials don't always tally with what Syrians believe themselves. Overall, in Europe, people think Syrians fled the war. So a bomb is falling on your house, you run away from the bomb. To some extent, yes, that's the case. But actually, most Syrians, they flee not the war, but the repression. And because the war is gone, but the repression is back. Now in Europe, there's especially right-wing politicians who think, well, you can go back now, there's no war. But it's not the war that people were, per se, fleeing from. So most Syrians are seen as either sad, bad, or mad, right? Either refugees or terrorists or traumatized. But their political identities and why they were in these prisons because of 2011 is ignored. And I think that that's what gets to people the most. Now, finally, I want to show some examples of, just one example of kind of social media research, right? So, in essence, a mukhabarat officer is supposed to live secretively. And he certainly shouldn't be having a Facebook account. And lo and behold, plenty of these mukhabarat agents they have social media accounts. Maybe not Instagram or TikTok, but they have Facebook, right? So what we did is we set up an account that looked relatively pro-Assad. And we started contacting people. And lo and behold, they would accept our friendship requests and start talking to us. And we would even be honest about what we're researching. We said, this is a conflict. People are killing each other. What do you think is going on? And gradually they would start talking about their work or start talking about how their work impacts their private life, for example. So this is a gentleman that we found. He's from Jableh, which is right next to Latakia. And we found him through a network of Alawite community groups. So Mohammed Salman. And the first time we found him, I kind of clicked on his pictures, and then they don't put their photos on private. They're public, so you can see all the photos. I haven't figured that out yet. So I zoomed in on the photo. And not only is this a typical example of the inside of a branch, so the administrative room, but also it even says on his name tag here, Mohammed Faiz Salman is head of the branch 287 in Latakia. Right, so of course we take this, we pluck this, we harvest all of these images from his account, and there's of course I realize there are ethical issues there of like personal rights and whatnot, but it weighs up against the violence. We can talk about that. And some of them will start talking. There were also people who immediately rejected us, paranoid, or they were afraid, also for themselves, of course, rightly so. But in many cases, we actually had some good rapport with them. And that will also be in the forthcoming book, I hope. Now, finally, I want to end with this. This is the Peace Palace in The Hague, which, of course, is where the International Court of Justice resides, right, which is now arbitrating between Israel and Palestine. And they, 2 years ago, Canada and the Netherlands, they filed a torture case against the Syrian regime for having violated the Convention on Torture. And the two conclusions, after hundreds and hundreds of interviews that they did, and that they collected through the IIIM, the United Nations mechanism, is A, torture is entrenched throughout the system of detention. And number two, the prison system is a national trauma that will affect society for decades to come. And the women that you see here, almost all of them, they are those who, of course, lost their family members or their family members were missing. A little bit like the Madres of the Plaza de Mayo in Buenos Aires or the Juantes Anneleri in Istanbul, right? That's it from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was an incredible paper, very very important and deeply confronting. I'd like to throw it open to questions, and I'm going to shamelessly use my position as chair to leap in with the first question, if I may. To what extent do you see the current system of oppression as a continuation of the colonial system of repression, and to what extent do you see it as something new and quite new and distinctive?
Yeah, I mean, this of course is I think a really important question for the kind of longue durée, and I think there are two elements of it that really are from the playbook of the French colonial authorities. I think one of them is, it's not related directly to the prison system, but the fact that you can use airstrikes, and you use the air force against your own society. And so the first bombs that ever fell on Damascus were, of course, not in 2011 or 2012, but they were 1925 in the Great Syrian Uprising, when basically Syrian Arab elites, they felt that their own grassroots forms of consultation or democratic initiative was taken away from them because of the mandates. Right? And Professor White has written a book about it, how the West stole democracy from the Arabs, which is a terrific piece of work. And as soon as that uprising comes into play, there's no consultation or not taking these people seriously, but airstrikes on Damascus. And that is something, of course, that the post-colonial authorities start mimicking. And then the first prison, of course, was in Syria was not established by the French colonial authorities, but by the Ottoman Empire. But the way the prison regime and the kind of techniques of imprisonment and detention and the rationales of it, they were to some extent a little different. Because the prison, so Mezze prison was established by the French, and the Arab nationalists and the Syrian independence activists that were involved there, they were placed there indefinitely, based also on military law, right? So, but this is actually to militarize it, or to use military law against what is a legitimate political activity. So those two things, those are serious echoes from the French past, of course. And surely there are also other ways, like torture techniques, but they already go into let's say the 60s, for example, using electricity, using like small radios that you can wind up, and then it gives an electric shock current through the body. And this is something, of course, the French authorities were using in Algeria in roughly the same time and period, where the Ba'athist party was almost in power in Syria. So there are some serious parallels there and continuities.
Thank you. Other questions? Lucas.
Yeah, I would also thanks Uğur for this very instructive and impressive lecture presentation. I would like to hear you about a contextualization, comparison also of the extreme Gulag, as you call it, I think poignantly, pertinently, with other also quite heavy prison arrangements in the Near East, like, let's say, Turkey has built up much more prisons. Of course, I know there are important differences. Nevertheless, I would like to hear you about that. Or, for example, in Syria, the huge camps administrated by the Syrian Democratic Forces of ISIS members. In Israel, thousands of administrative prisoners. I just wanted to see you a little bit put this extreme case into context.
Yeah, thank you, Hans Lucas. I mean, that's exactly the type of comprehensive approach that I expected from you. This is basically how we worked also a long time ago. I mean, how do we know whether an intelligence agency or a case or a prison system is is bad, is high, is low? I mean, there's no way of calibrating it without any implicit or explicit comparative understanding, of course. And the advantage here is that because I wrote the book with Jaber, Jaber has a profound understanding of prison systems in the Arab world in general. So he, for example, has also compared the Syrian Gulag to, let's say, that of Saddam Hussein. I mean, relatively equally violent Ba'athist regime, or let's say Gaddafi, who of course was also they had a couple of pretty notorious large prison camps. Then of course, I mean, Iran has a really long tradition of imprisonment, detention, lots of memoirs that came out of that. So there are many interesting ways of comparing it, and the examples you give, I think, also are very striking. And I think there are a number of things we can say about it. One is we should find out which criteria we're going to use to compare them with, right? Because I once interviewed a Syrian Kurdish man who was by now he's around 50 years old, who was imprisoned in Syria. Then he was released. He ran off to Turkey. Then he got into trouble because of Gezi Park, and he was imprisoned in Turkey as well. And then he was released, and so we interviewed him. And it's interesting because you would immediately say, you know, the treatment in Turkey is royal treatment compared to what you get in Syria, of course. I mean, this is a snapshot. This is an individual example that you need to systemize much more. So I think levels of violence is one important thing, right? So what is the intensity, the frequency, and also the diversity of torture methods that people are ultimately subjected to? And I think the one example in Turkish history would be the prison in Diyarbakir, of course, in 1980, the most infamous example where people were beaten, tortured, electrocuted, profoundly humiliated, forced to eat human feces. So that level of abjection we only see actually there in Diyarbakir. And now, when we look at recent conditions, the difference is maybe that there are broader ramifications in Turkey, let's say, also in Iran. So they have maybe more prisons, and they throw people in jail for a tweet, for example, or for something really simple. But at the levels of violence, for example, they don't compare with Syria even before 2011. Well, they do compare, but they're lower. And that's a simple reality. And these levels also change. For example, in Israel, before October 7, the levels of violence were somewhat lower than what they are now, right? And also the spurious, like, anti-terrorism aspersions that the Israeli authorities cast on Palestinians. Any man in a military age, that can be anywhere between 10 years old and 70 years old, is arrested and a priori suspected of being a member of this or that organization. So, for example, the criteria based on which the regime picks people out of society, that's an interesting one as well. And that we see there's definitely a parallel with the Assad regime. But I think only a systematic analysis would look for it. For example, the administrative context and processing is interesting. How much paperwork does a prison produce about a prisoner, right? So I mean, I know people who, one Syrian man we interviewed, also as a form of psychological pressure, when he was sitting there and the jailer is the investigator is across him and the torturer is standing on the left. On the table, they put his dossier. So they brought like a big binder, this big, he says, slammed it on the table, and he said, "Look what type of shit we have to deal with you in this regime. Is this what you're spending your time on?" Right? And in other cases, people had zero paperwork. They were brought into the torture chamber. There's no even an empty page to sign. There's nothing. They brought into the chamber, they beat the crap out of them, and then they send them back and throw them in the street in the middle of the day. So that's interesting. Why is it that in one case there's a semblance of an investigation and in other case there isn't? And in Iran, for example, there's a lot of paperwork. What we know from memoirs from Iranian prisoners is that people, what people have published or what they've written, it's all in these dossiers. So if ever, for example, the Iranian regime would fall and the prison authorities and archives, for example, become accessible, you would have a lot of work to do there. But that's the levels of violence, one administrative processing. So you can look at it in various ways. And then hopefully somebody else will do that, write that book.
Thanks.
Other questions? Umit.
Yes, I have a question too. I have actually a couple of questions. Thank you, Uğur. This is really fascinating and mind-blowing research and the series of publications and the forthcoming book. I'm truly looking forward to reading and learning it from you over the course of time. My first question is regarding this notion of political security you have talked about. I mean, besides the other kinds of security apparatus in the whole state state structure, and it reminds me of the organization and the mindset in this political security. It reminds me of the political Department of Political Affairs in the Ministry of Interior in the late Ottoman Empire. It's this ikinci şube, kind of, you know. And also, I was wondering, is there any kind of imperial framework or legacy that they are bequeathing? And also, I'm talking about the period after 1925, the Great Syrian Revolt. Did they also learn or pick up anything from the French mandate in this particular time period? And my second question is about the finance of all these big operations. You know, what are the financial sources, formal or informal, legal or illegal, of all these operations? You know, the prison system, muhaberat, secret prison, civil prison, central prison. I mean, is can we, of course, maybe it's a naive question given the system and the political regime in Syria, but is there any possible way to trace the sources of this operation, financial resources of this operation within the state budget or within the state system? My last question is about the muhaberat members. How are they recruited? How are these guys selected among the society? Because they are they are members and parts and parcel of this society as well. And how are these people, used and recruited? And are they in the payroll? How are they paid, being paid, and whatnot? Their ethnicity and etc. What are the measurements to recruit these, let's say, perpetrators? But also they are state officials, right?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, great.
It was fascinating. Thank you.
Excellent. It's great questions. I mean, see, when you bring great minds together, then really good questions come out of it. So that's exactly what these seminars are for, I think. Really great questions. They require like separate studies, I think. I mean, we tried to trace the genealogy of this prison system, right? I mean, it's not realistic or fair or just factual even to pin everything on the Assad regime. It's all because of Assad. Before that, Syria was fine, but that's not the case, of course, right? So there are certain layers of like bureaucratic practices and state traditions that carry out over from the one state to the other. So the fact that we have the Emniyet Umumiye, for example, the ikinci şube, I mean, is it a coincidence that the French called the state security the Deuxième Bureau? Yeah, that would be an incredible coincidence, no, if they called it that. So that's exactly what they call it. French intelligence in colonial, French mandate Syria, colonial Syria, was called the Deuxième Bureau, and the Deuxième Bureau was run by French professional colonial officers. And as soon as it was independent, this guy called Abdulhamid Sarraj takes over, and he calls it the Deuxième Bureau. He calls it Farah Thani. So second bureau, ikinci şube, basically. So there are interesting continuities there. I mean, what's interesting is that the one state practice becomes layered on top of the other, and then the other one again on top of the other, and then it amalgamates into something unique. Now, so Jaber would say, we had discussions with Jaber about this, and Jaber says, no, the Syrian prison system is unique. And I said, yes, it's unique, but it's like the Holocaust is unique. So, I mean, everything is unique, but what makes it unique and why is it unique in that way? This is what we have to come up with, to try to understand. And so the interesting thing here is that, yes, there's an amalgamation, but there's also separation. So there is the old Ottoman prison, there's Damascus Central Prison, right? It's in the middle of the city. It's actually an old Arabic house. You know, it has like a courtyard and where you have like in like in Antep or in Diyarbakir, you have these old Iwan, and then on top you have the rooms. And those were basically the prison cells. That was the old Ottoman prison. And we devote also a section of the book to that prison, what happened to it. And very quickly it was decommissioned because it could only take like 40 people, right? But that's not the state capacity and the infrastructural power that the French authorities or the Assad regime later wanted to have on the society. They needed a much bigger capacity. So the French built Mezza, and the Assads built Tatmos, and Bashar al-Assad built Saidnaya, and God knows what his son, who is very likely to become the next president of Syria, is going to build. So that's a good way of looking at it. How does it build on top of each other, and how does it amalgamate? Then the finances. Of course, all of this comes straight out of the state budget. Comes out of the lump sum of the state budget. Syrians pay taxes. The regime has revenue. They put all the revenue in the Ministry of Finance, apportions 20%. I don't know how many percent, because we don't have the figures for it. We have it for other, like for the Ministry of Education, and even for the army, we have it, but not for the Mukhabarat. So we have no idea how much, but people are paid relatively well. They're paid fairly comfortably. Those are the kind of legal sources of finance. And then there's lots of illegal sources of finance, of course. I'll give you two examples. So military intelligence is responsible for the border between Syria and Iraq. Right? And this is, as you know, this is a desert. And so in the 1980s and 90s, they don't maybe control every inch of the desert. They don't. Smugglers are coming in and out, weapons smuggling, drug smuggling, this smuggling, that smuggling. And the local military intelligence boss, for years, let the smuggling happen if there was a little bit of a cut for him on the side, of course. Right? So that, and that, of course, went into his villa or went into appointing more of his own family members. Another example of, really interesting example of illegal sources of revenue, illegal also even by Syrian standards. So is the extortion of the detainees and of the detainees' families, right? You go to a demonstration, you're arrested, you're in some dungeon somewhere, your parents don't know where you are. So your parents are frantically searching for you. They go first to the military intelligence. He's not here. They go to the Air Force intelligence. He's not here. They go to state security, political security. Finally, they think we need to pay somebody off. So they find an intelligence officer. They pay him $5,000. Can you please find out where our son is? And the guy says, yeah, I can do it, but not for $5,000. But if you give me $10,000, then I can help you out. So they sell their business. I mean, these are real stories. They sell their business. They give all their money to this intelligence officer, who, of course, is not going to work for it at all. He pockets the money, and then he comes up with excuses to the family, or sends them off, or tells them that the son is dead, for example. The family goes home, and then the son shows up 2 years later. So these type of, so the violence and also, let's say, judicial crime is profoundly intertwined with each other. The extortion of detainees' families is probably the Mukhabarat made millions of it and continues to make a lot of money off it, actually. And this is only one example. Also, if you want to visit your family member, you pay off the Mukhabarat, you can stay 5 minutes longer, for example. And then finally, recruitment. That's a very good question. There are various, let's say, routes of recruitment. On the one hand, and there may be three major ones. One is through its patronage network, trusted patronage network. Right? Somebody is in the Mukhabarat, the brother is in the army, and the cousin will then apply for a job in the other intelligence agency. So there are family networks of trusted patronage network closely tied to the regime. Then there are let's say business ties. There are certain businessmen, business companies, for example, that work very closely with the Mukhabarat, such as in construction, such as in transport. And those people will often also be recruited through that way. And then third are the obviously sectarian networks. So communities of Alawites in Homs, in Latakia, in Tartus, in Masyaf, in various places. Like most Alawite families, they have at least one or two or three or four family members who work in the Mukhabarat. So if a little boy, like little Hassan, for example, he fails his high school exam and he can't get into some degree, he can always call Uncle Ali and he can always work for the Mukhabarat. Right? So there's a kind of attraction there. There's almost a symbiosis, actually, of the Alawite community in Syria, communities in Syria, and some communities more than others. With the Mukhabarat, it is always a way out there. And one of the best examples of that is, I'm pasting it here in the chat, is the investigation that we did into one of the massacres in Syria, where the perpetrator's father was already in the Muqawara. The father was under state security, and the son then he signed up in the military intelligence. I would think for a second the dynamic between father and son, the way that sons look up to their fathers in the Middle East, the way that the father encourages actually working for the regime. In a way, that little boy that massacred 300 people in Syria, in a way, he had no chance. I mean, or at least there was some path dependence here for signing up in the Muqawara. And then, of course, there are also people who, like Vladimir Putin always says, one day I knocked on the door of the KGB and I told them I want to work for them. When that happens too. But then, of course, they investigate you first, profoundly. If there's only a shred of doubt of any of your family members being not loyal to the regime, there's no way you're getting it.
May I ask a question? Sorry.
No, I can't help myself to say that that's the best, the most rigorous illustration of the sociology of violence in contemporary world I have ever seen over the course of 15 years. So I just really want to say that. Otherwise, I would have felt really bad. So thank you. It's mind-blowing.
Thanks, John.
May I ask a question about the Arabic version of the book? How are you planning to distribute that, or how are you planning to get that to the Arab reading public?
Well, that's a good one. As you know, the Arab world, I mean, there's a lot of authoritarianism, and what you can publish where is strictly limited. And there are a number of places where that are a bit more, let's say, a bit more liberal environment. Beirut is one of them right now. It always was, actually. So even like some of those memoirs, like Mustafa Khalifa, was published in Beirut, for example, and not in Syria. I mean, Lebanon always had a very liberal media landscape. Egypt, Cairo is one. Then in Morocco, it's also possible to publish it. In Istanbul, there's now the Arab Network for Research and Studies, for example, they can do it. So it can at least reach people. It will at least be in the bookshelves, right? Now, inside Syria, that's going to be an interesting doozy, because obviously completely impossible to sell it and publish it. And even I suspect that if you're caught with this book, then you're in serious trouble. So it's probably going to be like it always was in Syria, which is people are going to download PDFs. I'm happy to just forfeit my whatever rights to download this book and read it, but then you make sure that you delete it from your hard drive as soon as you read it. And there will also maybe be people who you used to have them. I used to see them in the metro in Turkey. Actually, these people would read a book, and then the cover of the book was a newspaper that they covered it with separately, so to make sure that nobody could see what the book is and what they're reading. So, dangerous literature very often is treated in this way. It was also like that in Syria before, but we suspect that hard copies we won't be able to get into the country. But digital copies, in a way, you don't have to, because half the population is out of the country. So Syrians can read it in other countries.
Do you also plan an Iranian version of the book, a Farsi version?
We didn't, but if you know any publishers, then let us know.
Yes, I know one. The one that published the Talat biography in the Netherlands, in Amsterdam, Iran Academia. You must know Iran Academia.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, that's a good one.
They publish books, free books, by the way. So it's that they do not sell them. So it's PDF, but they also print them on demand. So we had a really good experience, my translator and I.
Yeah.
And I could recommend it. I would think that for an Iranian public, it would be important to know more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a very good point, Hans Lucas. And in fact, we never thought about it, actually. But I think you're right, because I see too often, even well-informed Iranian friends of mine, they have no idea what's going on inside Syria overall. So for the public also would be important. This is the regime that your government is propping up. So.
Yeah.
Fascinating. Look, this has just been absolutely incredible. I don't want to cut off the discussion, but I am aware that it's a very busy morning for you, and that we should probably let you get to the rest of your day. So please join me in thanking Uğur for an absolutely fascinating paper, absolutely brilliant. Just before you go, a quick note that our next paper will be on Friday, the 11th of October from 10 to 11 a.m. And our speaker, Sebastian Meredith from the University of Newcastle, will present on EU enlargement and the troubles of integration. And this event will be online and in person. And we hope to see you there.